Thanks, Benny. You've eaten up 2 minutes of our time, Benny. Did you all have a good day? Not too tired? Okay, great. So you all know the speakers, and we're here to talk primarily around, but not just about, Tarun's book, which is about trust and entrepreneurship. And Tarun, you begin with the premise that there are certain countries, largely developing, to use a loose phrase, which are characterized by low trust. And that therefore entrepreneurs who function in these economies have a double task, because they can't set their businesses up against a backdrop of trust. They've got to create the trust, what you call create the conditions to create. So will you tell us your thesis and follow immediately with one example of a country, possibly a company, possibly in India, which created this environment of trust to prosper?
First of all, thank you all for being here late in the afternoon. It's beautiful. It's always lovely to be in Jaipur at this time of year, particularly if you're from snowy Boston. So it's lovely to be here. And thank you, Mohit, for introducing the panel. So I wrote this book, Trust, Creating the Foundations for Entrepreneurship, which is the title of the session, because I was actually a bit frustrated with the characterization of the way trust was talked about, at least in the academic and popular literature, which is essentially the way that Mohit started by characterizing it, which is some countries are low trust and some are high trust. And the reason I found it a little bit frustrating was that it sort of has this presumptuous that this categorization of your level of ambient trust is somehow given from above. Some people are predisposed to being trusting and others are not, which I found rather jarring and didn't really sit well with my own personal experiences. When I thought about, I'm primarily an academic, but I am also a sometimes entrepreneur. And when I thought about my own experiences and those of entrepreneurs that I respected deeply, I sort of came to this conclusion, if you will, or let me say it more modestly. I thought of a hypothesis that I would like to subject to all our collective tests, which is that one of the things that you need to do, as Mohit was just saying, borrowing a phrase that I've used, not only do you have to create something novel, which is of course the definition of being an entrepreneur, but you also have to create the conditions that allow you to do the creation. In other words, you have to take care of all the underlying reasons why there is so much malfeasance and mistrust around you. And the entrepreneurs that I respect ended up thinking of trust not as something that was God-given, if you will, or exogenously determined, but they thought of it as almost an investment decision. It's something that they could take steps to ameliorate, to ameliorate the mistrust or to augment the trust, and think of it much as in the way that we think of other intangibles. For those of you who are from the business world or think about economics or are chartered accountants, etc., we have a notion of goodwill, and that's an intangible, and it's always represented on the balance sheet. It's difficult to get to, and we have various approximations, but at least it's an attempt to realize that it has some real effect. So why not trust? Well, perhaps trust is embedded in the goodwill, it's possible. But in any case, intangibles can be thought of as something that you invest in over time. So is intellectual property. It's an intangible, and everybody recognizes that it is the result of investment decisions over time. So why not think of trust as something actionable? So the book really is my own field notes, if you will, of my personal, if I'm allowed to say, screw-ups, as well as some modest successes, and more importantly, those of others. So Mohit asked for an example, and I think the example that recurs in the book a few times is that of microfinance, which is always a contentious industry because it has been subject to abuse on occasion, but it's also the engine of much productive change in society after society. I had the good fortune to be involved with a very large microfinance firm in India, but also to be close to the largest microfinance firm in Latin America, then called Banco Compartamos in Mexico, as well as to Abed Bhai, who founded BRAC in Bangladesh, which is the world's largest NGO, and they had a microfinance firm. And microfinance is really predicated on trust at a variety of levels. At its core, it involves giving small sums of money, loaning money to groups of individuals, very often women, mostly women in most countries, with the idea that they will solve what economists call both the adverse selection and moral hazard problems. In other words, they will deal with the fact that it's difficult for an outside entity to figure out who is creditworthy and who is not, because every woman in a small village knows that Lulu is trustworthy, but that I am not, right? And so they would include Lulu in the lending circle. And effectively, they're solving a problem that normally banks would require you to submit your financial statements to address. That's called solving the adverse selection problem. And on the other hand, when the time comes to collect the loan back, Lulu is going to pay because the last thing that she wants is to be seen as a deadbeat by not paying. And she would lose the respect of all her fellow women members in the community. So that's what microfinance really is. And it recurs in country after country, country after country. It's involved in, it's fundamentally based on trust between the women. And there are various other layers also that I can elaborate, but let me make sure that we hear from others.
Yeah, so Tarun, what the example you gave was of an entrepreneurial organization and cashing on trusts that already existed in society. And therefore not central to the thesis that there is no trust. And therefore the question becomes of finding examples of organizations that actually built trust where it didn't exist. Perhaps, Naushad, you would like to talk about that.
So, first, thank you, Mohit. It's always wonderful to be at JLF. I'll give you, I think trust gets built step by step over long periods of time. I think it's also possible to destroy trust very rapidly. But the construction of trust, I think, takes many small steps. And then there usually comes some kind of a big occasion or a big test. And how the firm reacts at that point in time determines whether trust is reinforced and further built or whether it collapses. And I think a good example of what happened when many organizations were tested was during the pandemic. And I think companies reacted in many different ways. First, all companies were really consumed, especially in India, especially in our country, with survival, simple survival. And companies reacted in different ways. I'll say that for our own organization, and we were not alone, there were many other really good organizations that I think reacted in similar ways, where we said, we will protect all jobs for people in the company, for all our contractors as well, and make sure that each of the contractors paid their people full salaries, and we put a mechanism in place to chase that down and so on. It worked really well, and when things reopened, we had no problem getting everyone back to work and really quickly because that basis of trust had been built. I'll give you an example which I think is sort of runs counter to the developed country thesis, which is that if you look at just one industry, which is hotels in India, the Indian hotel chains seem to do a much better job of protecting their employees than the foreign hotel chains. And my basis for saying that is that I would go around and ask people, so what happened to you in the pandemic? And this would be, let's say, the driver who was generally a contract employee who would pick you up from the airport or drop you at the airport and so on. And typically, an Indian hotel chain, a Taj, a Leela, an ITC, an Oberoi, people were protected right through. The foreign hotel chains, people were just let go right away, especially all the contract people. And I think that came from the way in which their parent firms dealt with the same issue in their own country, where it was governments that stepped forward and supported people, while in India, if your company didn't support you, you had nothing. And so that difference didn't show in how people were treated on the ground. And I think the Indian firms actually ended up behaving in a much better and more honorable way that was suited to the particular circumstance. But I'll add one comment, which is
I think we should allow the claps, the patriotic claps, yeah.
Where I do agree with Tarun fully, which is that I do think that companies can build trust quite systematically as a differentiator in doing business. So not just doing it as something that is very good to do in itself, which is an important thing, but to do it as something that actually sets one apart. And you see this in particularly murky businesses in our country, like the real estate business. And you go to particular names and brands who have a reputation for trust simply because it's a murky business and you want to go to someone that you can rely on.
And you stand out because of it. So how important is trust when you look at building a brand, Lulu? And can you give us some example?
Well, trust is the cornerstone of brands. As Tarun was saying earlier, he talked about intangible value. Brands are intangibles, and increasingly, intangibles are a much larger portion of enterprise value than your hard materials or hard assets. And I look at the world through the lens of a brand evangelist. And you're absolutely right in the sense that when you build a strong brand, it signals trust, and that is a differentiator in many, many categories. If we look at jewelry, for example, Tanishq has built a phenomenal business over 30 years because of the trust that it delivers day in and day out. It goes back to what you said. It's not just about fancy campaigns, but delivering reliably, consistently, exceeding the consumer's expectations day in and day out. So
In fact,
absolutely foundational.
I think it, in fact, illustrates what Naushad was saying. They came into an industry which, like real estate, was seen as being murky, and people didn't trust the valuation that you placed on the gold. They didn't trust the gold, and therefore, in every showroom, they put a gadget which could assay gold.
Yeah.
So they actually capitalized on the fact that there was no trust in that industry and built it.
I just want to add a data point there as well, Mohit, that brands that are trusted have greater contribution to their businesses, and the index of strong brands actually beats the S&P and other indices. So that really shows the economic value of trust through brand.
Okay, we've got Justice Chauhan sitting there, but I'm not going to bring you in right away because then you will overtake everything else. I'm just going to go to the question of how easily trust is destroyed. And I want to go back to the industry that you talked about, which is the microfinance industry. So you had this industry which emerged from nowhere, did a singular service to the women, especially of one state, which was the unified Andhra Pradesh, and it was destroyed almost overnight. So can you comment on that?
I think pretty much everybody's comment is consistent with the idea that trust is malleable and can be actively manipulated, if you will, or invested in over time. I think that's the important thing to keep in mind. It's also fragile, as this thread of the conversation suggests. So I had a ringside view, which I describe in the book, and I've written about and spoken quite stridently in public about this.
Including here once earlier.
Including here, really? I can't remember.
It's okay. Authors forget, interlocutors remember.
Okay. But what happened was there were a set of organized microfinance firms that were operating in India. I won't say that all of them were ethical, but many of them were. I was privileged to be part of one of the ones that I thought was amongst pretty much the best organizations I have been,
SKS, right?
SKS, been affiliated with. It got excoriated in the press, excoriated. And the core was that it was outcompeting the state-run self-help groups who, it appeared, were somehow diverting money that came to them from the World Bank into their own pockets. And the poor women in the villages in unified Andhra Pradesh were voting with their feet and opting to come to organized microfinance and opt for allegedly higher interest rate microfinance loans than what the state allegedly offered, except the de facto rate on the state's loan was incredibly high for all kinds of corruption-related reasons. So they were not trusted at all. And organized microfinance had built the trust piece by piece over years. And the state simply lashed back by simply declaring organized microfinance to be irredeemably corrupt, the irony, and ruled it effectively ordered out of business. There was an arrest warrant put out for all our senior management. I remember we were having a board meeting in the state, and we immediately decamped to Mumbai, just for safety reasons. A lot of my best people were thrown in jail. There's no notion of habeas corpus justice here. And they simply languished. We had some deaths. It was really a tragedy.
Which therefore brings us to Justice Chauhan. You were asked a question.
Did you notice the segue? Yeah.
Oh, very well done. Better theater than falling off the stage, which was what somebody recommended to you. Which is that the state should provide the backdrop of trust. Instead, here we have a situation where one arm of the state, in this case politicians, actually went out actively and destroyed trust. You represent another arm, which is the legal and justice system. How good a job has it done of preserving a backdrop of trust in this nation?
If you look at the performance of the judiciary for, let's say, for the last 70 years, I would say there are two sides of the same coin. When we developed and invented the public interest litigation jurisdiction, we certainly expanded not only our litigation, but most importantly, we strengthened the people's belief and trust in the judicial system. So that's one part of it, and it's a unique jurisdiction that does not exist anywhere else in any other jurisdiction throughout the Commonwealth countries. And in fact, a lot of people are trying to learn from our experience, but that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is when people wonder, why does it take so many years, decades for us to decide a case? And I think if you look at the present scenario, or I would say the scenario from the last 20 years, people are in fact beginning to lose trust in our judiciary. And there are two examples that I can give. If you look at the national data, you will realize that the institution of civil cases in India is beginning to decline, because it's the civil side or the civil cases which take the longest, on an average about 30 to 40 years to be decided, which is quite a long time. I mean, who wants to go to the court for 30 to 40 years and to face numerous judges like us? That's one part of it. The other part is that when people have started saying, for example, take the criminal system, the easiest way the people feel justice has been done, and I'll give you a glaring example from Hyderabad, where I was the Chief Justice at that moment. Allegedly, a lady veterinary doctor was raped and murdered. The police took these 4 alleged offenders and shot them dead in the wee hours of the morning. People were absolutely happy. Justice has been done, because people are getting tired of the slow method of convicting people. So that is the trust deficit. But we are trying to, live up to our reputation. And as Lulu rightly said, like a jewelry shop, judiciary can exist and progress only as long as we have the people's trust. The day we lose the trust of the litigant, we are done for.
I want to point to one more fact, just to expand on your point. We have a situation which I think is unique in the world, just like PIL, where 2/3 of the people in jail have not yet been convicted. This goes to the heart of what it means to be an individual, which means to be free. And if you cannot enforce that, your entire judicial system is based on the fact that you are innocent till you are proven guilty. Therefore, by definition, you're innocent, but we will throw you in jail. What are Chief Justices like you doing? What are you able to do, and what are the constraints? Because I'm sure this is not part of your intent. What are you able to, and what are you not able to do to tackle this?
You have raised a very pertinent issue, because today we are grappling with this issue. Is bail the rule and jail the exception, or is it the other way around? Now, since we come from the common law tradition, yes, the first principle of criminal jurisprudence is every man is presumed to be innocent till proven guilty, and the burden of proving his guilt does lie on the shoulder of the state. However, having said that, the difficulty is because there's a lack of infrastructure. If you look at judge to population ratio in India, you have 101 judge to 1 lakh people. In the United States, 125 to 1 lakh people. Now, considering the immense population that we have, the question I, as a Chief Justice, would ask myself is, why not increase the number of courts? But that is where the difficulty comes in. As the Chief Justice of Telangana, I needed 1,070 judicial officers. That means 1,070 courts. I only had 349 courts. When I asked the government that, would you mind increasing the number of vacancies and number of posts for the judiciary, the answer I got was, sorry, we can't do it. Well, if you can't do it, and each of my judicial officer is saddled with 6,000 cases in the court, how do you expect a judicial officer at the age of 25 to decide your cases in 1 year? 6,000 cases, 1 year is humanly impossible. Therefore, it takes a long time to decide the cases. And that is where the mistrust of the judiciary creeps in.
I have an idea.
Yeah, okay, great. Tarun is going to solve the judicial problems of India.
We might as well
If we
make
can, we will give him the Nobel Prize for the judiciary.
No, I'm going to make it up. But, I think I was talking to Naushad earlier, and he helpfully reminded me that the flip side of mistrust being a problem is that it's an opportunity, right? That you can think of these absence of societal mechanisms that normally foster trust as being problems, but they're also problems that any entrepreneur sees the glass as half full. And so what about if an entrepreneur comes up and says, and I know that there is a very well-developed system of I don't know what the legal, the technical terms are, but outside court arbitration.
Arbitration,
right?
yeah.
So, but isn't there a way for someone to come up with an approach that is a scalable, trustable arbitration process?
Tarun, you're absolutely right. In fact, we are trying to create India and to project India as a hub of international arbitration. However, again, there's a dichotomy. The dichotomy is that on the one hand, the government says, we will want India to become the hub, and yet the government passes circulars saying any case where the dispute is more than 10 crores, please don't go into arbitration.
But I just want to interject and say that even if it works, this is only going to solve the civil cases. As far as the criminal cases are concerned, actually we have a mechanism which goes back a long time back, which is called gundas, right? Controlled by the local landlords. They sorted out, decided who was guilty, but that's obviously not the way forward, yeah.
So just two comments on the judiciary. I think the point is not only how long the cases stay pending, but if there is differential treatment for different litigants. And if you have differential treatment, if you're Arnab Goswami, the Supreme Court hears your case within a week, right? Within a week, right?
No, less than that.
Or less than that.
24
right?
hours. He was given bail.
Which is remarkable, right? I mean, now, in a system which is as clogged as ours, right? And it's that I think causes then distrust. Because if the police deal with different individuals differently on the basis of where they are in society and who they know, I think then that's what fosters great distrust. By the way, the easiest way to at least partly declog courts is over half, I believe over half of all cases pending, the government is the litigant.
Oh, absolutely. They're the biggest litigant we have.
So if we simply address that, you could reduce the load by half.
Yeah, very clearly. So there was a... Yeah, please clap. I think stuff like this needs to be clapped and talked about in the public sphere. So, Justice Chauhan, another question which came up in the discussion earlier was that by design of the nation, courts are supposed to stand as separation of powers from the executive. And I think that's crucial to building trust, because if they're too closely aligned, you will not see that trust. Major statements, major decisions will be seen as being political. And there's more than enough evidence of that. What prevents courts from sitting up straight and saying, we have 32 vertebrae?
A colonial mentality. We have been colonized at least for 300 years. And if you really look at, and I'm sorry to say this, I do not mean to be disrespectful to anyone, but there's a lack of courage, and I'll give you a burning example. Recently, when Donald Trump conviction was to be recorded, the trial court judge of the United States, knowing fully well that he is the president-elect, passes an order of conviction with all sense of respect and objectivity, and he says, I cannot send you to the prison because I know you'll be occupying the White House, but nonetheless, I'll still convict you. That courage, unfortunately, I have not seen in the best of the judiciary anywhere in the world. You know, imagine an American judge convicting Biden, who is a serving president, his son. Would any of the judges in India would have the courage to convict a son of a leader in India, or even if a CM of a state? I have my doubts.
You're absolutely right.
And then we have the unfortunate event that those who do show courage, people make sure they're no longer sitting on the chair. They disappear. They meet with an accident. And then we are told that it's a heart attack. Fine. So who has that courage? And that courage needs certain moral gumption. It needs a training. It needs conviction in one's principles. Unfortunately, from what India is today, the lack of morality all over, not just in judiciary, in every sphere.
Oh, this is a horrible way to sort of come to the tail end of this. So I'm going to turn to Lulu and ask her
The brand.
ask her to tell us a good story about
Right. Okay.
about a situation where trust was destroyed. And in this particular case, I think it was engineered, that destruction of trust. It wasn't
Well,
innocent.
it goes back to
Yeah, but you tell us a good story. So we decided to talk about how Maggi noodles was made out to be public enemy number one. It was only coincidental that it was launched just around the same time that a certain powerful person was launching his own
I
brand
won't
of
even get into
noodles.
that part
no,
of
but
it.
you can tell us. No, that's why I said it.
Yes.
You didn't say it.
So
But
how
anyway,
many Maggie fans do we have here? Wow, that's phenomenal, right?
so the question is, the trust was destroyed. How did they rebuild trust? And also from your point of view, what was the role that branding and communication played in that?
Yeah. So quick context setting. Maggi, one of the most trusted brands, a love mark, 80% market share in the instant noodles category. In 2014, in an obscure town in Uttar Pradesh, a food inspector from the FSSAI was doing his rounds in Easy Day in the supermarket, and this yellow pack stood out at him, and it said no MSG. He picked it up, and he looked at it and said, no MSG? This is rubbish. I'm going to test this out. So he sent it to the lab. It happened to be Maggi. It came back, failed the test. It contained MSG. It had 7 times the amount of lead. They wrote to Nestle. Nestle was furious because of all of their testing, which had showed that it didn't have lead or MSG, and they sent it for another test. That test took some 6 months to come back because apparently it got lost in the post, which is also hilarious. But in the meantime, a newspaper in Uttar Pradesh broke the story that the FSSAI was going to ban Maggi nationwide. And this caught on like it was viral on social media. Consumers were absolutely outraged, and Nestle didn't know what hit them. However, the CEO, the global CEO, had come down in conversations with the regulator, took a very bold decision of recalling all of the packs. Some 3,800 tons of packs. It cost them $75 million, but they took every one of them, and quite complicated in terms of distribution, of getting it back, incinerated all of those packs. And then what did they do? They did 3 things to build back the trust. First, they doubled down on the quality testing after having got rid of all of those packs. Truly looked at all of the processes. So the first one was, of course, they got rid of the packs. The second thing that they did was increase the rigor of the testing, because it was the government tests versus their tests. So they had to find a way of showcasing that. They then appealed with the High Court. And then they were waiting for the High Court judgment. That's when they started preparing their communications. What was interesting is because Maggi is such a beloved brand and had built so much trust over decades, consumers actually missed the brand. Even though there was this possibility of it having lead, younger people on the internet were saying they miss Maggi. So when it came back in October, 5 months later, coincidentally at that same time, they used communication, transparency in how they talked about what it actually contained, and they brought back this lovely We Missed You Too, hashtag We Missed You Too campaign and a Maggi anthem, and connected with the emotions of consumers while assuring them.
I love
So
that
clarity,
word.
transparency.
I love the word transparency. Before we throw the floor open to questions, Tarun, I want you to just briefly dwell on something which we've not talked about, which is about building trust within the organization, not just outside, and how they mirror each other.
Well, I think the example that Naushad gave is similar to one that I've seen. So down the street from where I live in Boston is a grocery store called Wegmans, which is a chain of grocery stores. You can go in and buy your daily consumables just like you do over here. And it's indistinguishable from many of the others that you see over there. But it really goes out of the way to treat its employees differently. I forget the details, but it really makes sure that there is no pay disparity across the genders, goes out of the way to make sure that it recruits people from what constitute marginalized communities in that context. And there's a direct one-to-one mapping that we could do to our own circumstance here. And over time, I think, Mohit, that it not only builds trust with the employees, but it sends a very strong, credible signal to the rest of society that here is an organization that isn't just going to sell you an apple and detergent, but it's also going to do something that helps the ambiance, so to speak. And that goes back to the step-by-step building of this intangible, that you just feel good about it.
Patu Keswani, who runs Lemon Tree Hotel, said something very interesting once. He said, my job is to make my people happy, and then they make my consumers happy. I thought that was so lovely. Questions, please. Yeah, this gentleman here, and then this lady here, and then we'll see how much time we have.
Adi Godrej said there should be separation between the regulator and the government. My question to any of the panelists is, we have all read the book Godfather. If you didn't get justice by the court, would you go to the Godfather, someone like that, or not? That is the litmus test.
Anybody?
In fact, if you read a book called When Crime Pays, that is the entire thesis of that book. I believe it's written by Milan Vaishnav, if I'm not mistaken. He says where the state fails, and one of the reasons why you have criminalization of Indian politics is because the state has failed miserably. People turn to chudbhaiyas, the small, your goons. This is exactly what's happening with the judiciary. In Bihar, in Mumbai, and now even perhaps in other parts of the country, since people can't get their tenants out, I would rather go to the local goon and say, please get my tenant out, because if I fight an eviction case, it will go on for 40 years. I don't have 40 years. So that's exactly what's happening, that people are turning to godfathers and to smaller godfathers, smaller fish.
Yeah, this one.
Hi, good evening, everyone. So we've seen that, in establishing trust, there are many, many factors to it. But in entrepreneurship, who's the one who really orchestrates the establishing of trust? Who has the onus or the greatest sort of role in establishing trust for a company?
So, my answer would be, at the outset, it is the entrepreneur, right, who has to stitch together in a very small way. And over time, what you would hope for is that other people in the entrepreneurial venture themselves all contribute to trust building in different ways. Right? But the onus has to be on the person trying to, in the language that I use in my book, create the conditions to create. Not just create, but create the preconditions so that others can step into essentially a trust cocoon of some sort.
Please, yeah. We have a lot of hands. We'll see as many as we can get. Yeah.
Very good evening. It's a very nice conversation. मुझे लगता है इन इंडिया शिक्षा और चिकित्सा इंडस्ट्री की तरह चल रही है और शिक्षा में भी जो फैकल्टीज हैं दे आर नॉट वेल पेड. व्हाट इज द रीजन बिहाइंड इट एंड हु इज गोइंग टू लुक आफ्टर?
Anybody want to take that? Yeah, the teachers are not well paid. What's the
लेकिन
reason behind that?
इससे ट्रस्ट का क्या ताल्लुक है? आप क्या कहना चाहते हैं?
Good question.
They're not role models.
ये फैकल्टीज को इंडस्ट्री की तरह ट्रीट नहीं किया जाता. लाइक आई मीन इंडस्ट्री को लुक आफ्टर तो कोई करेगा ही ना.
नहीं, लेकिन इससे एक और सवाल उठता है कि सरकार भी एक्सपेंडिचर कर रही है ना on education and medicine. But people say we don't want to send our children to a government school. We don't want to go to a government hospital. So actually the question goes back to the trust that you have placed in your government to do these and it's not being able to do it. Now the people are trying to repair that. Aap ungli un pe utha rahe ho. So it's a fairly complex situation. Yeah, there are these two neighbors over here. One is wearing a beret and one is wearing a white beard. So you can take them in either order.
Good afternoon, I am Pradeep Mehta. It's being moderated by Mohit just a little while ago. Hi, Naushad. Naushad, just for your information, and a lot of people don't know this, we've done a lot of work on judicial delays. The fact is that there was a national litigation policy drafted at the time of the UPA. That was never implemented. Finally, the new government under Megwal has notified it. You're right, it's not 50%, it's 65% of the cases which are actually there because of the government. Now that is civil. As far as criminal is concerned, it's a separate issue. That requires a different approach. In the overall, what we have found is the kind of lackadaisical approach by many judges to these cases for obvious reasons, as Justice Chauhan spoke about, the overload of cases. And among other things, of course, there is a governance deficit which is expanding now, even in the judiciary. It is no more devoid of, any of these kind of things.
You've taken us back from hope to despair, Pradeep.
No.
Will you pass the mic to your neighbor? Yeah.
No, Mohit, the fact is that trust is actually declining, but by the way, at a local level, even the police officers, resolve your cases. So there are a lot of cases which are being resolved which don't go to the courts. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. And then to you, ma'am. Yeah.
So I'm ex-Air Force cardiologist, sir. We've seen a lot of medical devices coming up from India, but we still need Indian companies to build up trust. Trust is very important because a device which is implanted in a patient is a one-time device. So there have to be mechanisms and companies have to be alert to developing trust so that if it comes as Make in India pacemaker, I should be able to put it in patient. Okay, we had a problem in AIMS with certain Make in India. Second, sir, is on judicial system. Can we corporatize it? Can we corporatize it? Health wasn't being delivered well by government.
Okay, we've got the question. Yeah.
Actually, I'm going to, as somehow vaguely representing industry here, let me just say that I'm a person who believes in limited government, but I think the judiciary and the police are a government responsibility. You should not privatize. This is something that is a public service that has to be provided by the government in every society to every citizen. So, I mean, many other areas I would strongly support limiting government.
I would agree with you fully.
No, in fact,
let's not have a slanging match over here. But I just want to provide a slightly different answer, which is that you have two answers. One is that you go to the Bureau of Industrial Standards, which was set up for this reason, but nobody has trust in it. Therefore, it comes back to you, that it is your job as an entrepreneur to create that trust. I think the answer rests there. And if you say, I can't do it, it's an uphill task, you shouldn't be in that industry.
Standards can be privatized, by the way.
Yeah, the lady. No, actually, it was for the lady behind you. We can come to you later. Yeah, there's a long queue. Yeah, please.
Mohit, this one's for you, okay? For the thread of hope. So the question is for the judiciary on the panel. I love what you said about courage being a miss in the Indian context. Is there anything you can suggest which can foster courage in leadership that would allow for, the kind of conviction America fosters? That will be brilliant to hear from you.
Frankly speaking, I think, if I may say so, we must go back to our sense of morality unless people have a strong sense of morality, will not have courage, number one. Number two, unless you have a sense of identity, what we Indians lack is a sense of identity with our own country. And our education system is so messed up that we never teach our children about ourselves. We never teach them about our history, our culture, our heritage. If I ask this audience, how many of you have gone to the museums of your cities? I'm sure there won't be too many hands. Hardly 5, hardly 10. Now look at it, the majority of the... And we are the educated elite of India. How many have gone and seen a Gupta piece of art? Gupta art sets up the entire standard, the template for the entire Asian art from here to Japan, from here to Indonesia. And that is why Daraphalim's book, The Golden Road, is so important. I wish it were written by an Indian. It takes a person who is a non-Indian to tell us who we are.
Fair enough. In fact, some people have tried to delegitimize the book because it's, some people have tried to delegitimize the book because it's not been written by an Indian.
Excellent. What matters is the book.
Exactly. This lady here has a question. Yeah. Quickly.
So,
I wanted to expand on the courage with the judiciary. It's a very important point. I'm a filmmaker. I followed a gang rape survivor. Had the courage to tell the story, and so did the survivor. But then there is a very fine line between being courageous and being stupid, because that's what we were crossing all the time, because there will be no accountability. The death threats were increasing, and that's when, even though we had the courage, we just knew that we would never reach that point and we could die telling the story. So, sir, this is for you. We want to have the courage. How do we do it when we know the end result? We may not see it.
Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. I think the answer lies in Tarun's book. Trust. How many of you vote? Again, a minority. In this hall, again, a minority is voting. What happened to the majority? Why are you keeping silent? The question is, unless we elect the right sort of people, unless we build a trust in our own institution, when we see our institution being demolished, how is it that civil society is so silent? Nobody speaks. And to build a country, if you look at the United States history of 250 years, people have sacrificed their lives.
This is true. This is true, especially if you look at cinema centered around the blacks. There's movie after movie after movie which shows how long and how hard and with what personal sacrifice they had to struggle to create an equitable society. As far as we are concerned, we believe that after partition, after independence, we don't have to struggle anymore. So I think this is a very, very, very apt. I'm going to close on this note because I think it's a hopeful note, because it's a note that trust is not going to happen on its own. It's not going to happen from above. If you say, you know, X and Y is going to bring trust back, you're actually doing all of us a disservice because you're placing too much power in that person. Trust is going to be built by each of us. And sometimes it means just trust, you know, between Tarun and me, that he's not going to go over time or that somebody is not going to toss him off the... But more importantly, that we are all willing to fight for it. And if we don't, modern states are a fight between power and liberty. A nation state is a fight between power and liberty. Those who have power are going to try and aggrandize more of it. If you want more liberty, you've got to fight for it. Nobody's going to give it to you. And that is... Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful session. Thanks to all.
Thank you. It's a great session.
We took that, we had the courage, and we told the story.
Thank you.